Hello Unreal Engine games developers. In our continuing desert driving game series, today we're going to create some sounds for our game. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and make some noise. Welcome back everybody to the desert driving game series, and today we're going to add some sounds to the game. Specifically, we're going to add 3 different types of sounds which will show different programming techniques in Unreal Engine. So we're going to add an ambient desert sound. We're going to add an engine noise to our pickup truck that actually travels around with the truck. And finally, we're going to add a confirmation sound when you go through a gate. If you haven't seen any of these videos before, I've provided a link to the playlist so you can catch up on where we are. And the sounds that we're using today, I have also provided links to the sounds. I found them on freesound.org. You can use your own sounds if you want, but if you want to follow along exactly, then follow the links to the sounds and you can get those. Now, before we do anything in Unreal Engine, we need to prepare our sounds for use in the game. So specifically, we want to trim the sounds and we want to make them loopable. So you can use any software you like for the audio editing. I'm using something called Reaper here, but there's other software tools like Audacity that work equally as well. This is a pretty simple demand for audio editing tool. So we want to drag in our sounds here and make sure they're trimmed and looped. So let's start off with the desert sound. I've got my 2 sounds here that I downloaded. So let's drag in the desert ambience. And there's a bit of silence at the start before it comes in. And there's quite a lot of silence at the end. So let's trim it a bit. So at the start, turn the snap off. Drag it to here. So listen to that now. Wrong button there. Okay, so that sound comes in straight away. And let's also drag it at the end so that it ends. And let me just hear what it sounds like when it loops now. If I put the looping on and go to near the end and play it, it's not bad, but there's a kind of a noticeable little gap. So I'm going to show you a technique that's really useful for looping generally when you're doing sounds like this, and that is to pick a point in the middle. It doesn't really matter where, and split the waveform at that point. Then move or reverse those 2 waveforms. So now you know that the end of the waveform will loop seamlessly to the beginning because you cut it directly. You see, if I play it near the end, it loops straight in to the original. Again. And now what you can do in this middle part here is you can just overlap it a bit. So it'll create, most audio software will create this crossfade between those 2 waves. So where it faded out, it'll fade straight back in again. So now we have a perfect loopable ambient sound. And the last thing we need to do is render it out. Again, it'll be different in different pieces of software. The important thing is when you render it out, make sure that you render it without any excess tail. At the moment, Reaper will put a 1-second gap at the end. We don't want anything at the end. We want it to loop completely. So we'll put this in our sounds folder. We'll call it Desert Ambience and render that file. And we're rendering it as a 16-bit WAV file, which will work well in Unreal Engine. Okay, so that's the desert ambience prepared. Let's delete those WAV files now. And if I go back to my folder, I now want to prepare the engine sound. And I found this engine sound on Free Sound. Let's drag it in there, and again, there's a bit of a gap at the start. But this is a great sound. It has a sort of ignition sound at the start. And then a very consistent engine sound all the way through. Now don't worry about the fact that the engine sound is idling, because we'll use some techniques in Unreal Engine to adjust the pitch and volume to make it sound like the engine is revving. So the first thing we need to do, just like the Desert Ambience, is trim the sound. So I'm going to take snapping off and drag it up to the start, and similarly I'll drag the end there. So now we've got ignition on and the sound, engine sound, and at the end it dies away and then it'll restart again if I loop it. So that's our basic sound. So we want to render that first. So let me render that. Make sure again, no tail. And we're going to call this engine start. And now we want to create a loop within the sound. So let's put the snap on here. So again, just find a bit in the middle. I found this was very consistent. Little few seconds there. Let's just put the loop on. See what it sounds like. And that's great. It's pretty seamless. I don't have to do any crossfading like I did before. That works pretty well as it is. So let me just render this out as a WAV file, and we'll call this one engine loop, and render that. And now we have our sounds prepared. So I can come out of Reaper. Don't want to save anything. And if we go into our project in Unreal Engine, let's create a new folder. Sounds. And we'll open that up. And let's add in our sounds that we've just created. So these three, the Desert Ambience and the engine start and loop, we'll drag in here, and it automatically creates the WAV files in Unreal Engine. So we don't need the folder anymore. So we're going to start off with the ambience. And for the Desert Ambience, I want every player to have the Desert Ambience for the duration of the game. So it's very straightforward to play this. All I need to do is at the beginning of play for each player controller, I'll just add in a play sound. So let's open up our player controller. And if we go near the top, you've got the begin play section where we've been creating our widgets. So let's just create a bit of space where we can play the sound. So let's drag this out a little bit. Everything from the local player controller branch will move along. And now, if you drag from this branch here, you can play sound. And we want to play sound in 2D. So we don't want the sound to move around based on locations. We want the same Desert Ambient sound all the time. So play sound 2D, and we can select our Desert Ambient sound that we just installed. And let's compile that and save it. And let's just stick to single player for now. Selected viewport, and you can hear the Desert Ambient sound is playing. And there's one little additional thing we can do here. If you don't want the sound to just come in straight away, you want it to fade in, we can do that at the start of the game as well. So let's escape the game. And you might think, well, maybe I can just add a fade in here in the play sound, but it doesn't have a fade in option here, so we can't do that there. What we need to do is we need to use a fade in action, which unfortunately needs a reference to an object. So instead of playing sound, we need to spawn the sound and then fade in. So let's create a little bit more space again. Get rid of the play sound, and instead we'll use spawn sound 2D. So we'll select desert ambient sound again. So it's the same thing, except this time it provides a return value, so we can carry out actions on this sound that's been spawned. And if you drag off from this and do fade in, we'll tidy it up later on, you can say how long the fade in you want the fade in to last, and the volume level. So let's fade in for 2 seconds at the start of the game, and compile, save, and let's play. And you can hear you get a less dramatic and jarring entry into that sound. It fades in. So that's our first sound added, the desert ambience. Let's now look at the engine sounds, and the engine sounds are a bit more involved. We're going to add a sound component to the pickup truck, and the benefit of this is that the sound will follow the truck around, so other players will hear your vehicle coming towards them and the location from which it's coming. But we'll need to do a bit more if we want to do the sound changing as your speed changes. So let's build it up in layers, and to start off with, let's create what's called a cue for the sound. So let's go to your sounds folder, and what we'll do is we're not going to use just the plain waveforms. We're going to use something called a cue, which allows us to build up some more programming around the sound. So right click in the empty space, and under sounds we'll create a new sound cue, and we'll call this cue engine, and open it up. And something else you'll want to create as well here is something called an attenuation. The attenuation is the level at which the sound drops off depending on the radius, the distance from other players. So we'll just create a basic one here. There's parameters in there you can change, but we'll keep it simple and standard for this particular episode. So if you go into the attenuation settings and do create new sound attenuation, we'll put it in the same sounds folder, and we'll call it ATT engine, and save, and that will create a standard attenuation profile. So we have in our cue the output. We're going to start off with a very simple wave player to play the engine sound. So if you go to a wave player on the right hand side and drag it in, and click on it and select the engine start wave, and set it to loop. Even though this isn't our looped sound, later on when we start to crossfade it, you always need looping sounds. So just get in the habit of doing that, and then drag that into the output. Okay, so now we've created the basic sound cue. What we need to do now is add this to the pickup truck so that this sound follows the vehicle around. So save. Come back to your project and go into the vehicle variety pack, blueprints, pickup, and open the BP pickup that we've been using. To add the sound to the pickup truck, we go to the Add Component on the left-hand side, and if you click on Add Component and type Audio, we'll add an audio component. Actually, we don't want it to the spring arm, but I'll change that in a minute. Let's call this engine noise and move it so it's under the mesh. And now on the details, we can specify the sound that we want. So under sound, if you type Q, and there's our engine Q. We don't have to put anything else in because the engine Q had all the other information we needed. So leave that there and compile and save. And now this sound is attached to the truck and should play when we drive it around. So let's give that a go. Go into play. And you can hear the engine started straight away. But as we move around, there's no change in the noise. And eventually, because we've only got that one sound, it'll stop and restart again. So you'll hear in a second. There, stops, and then the loop starts again. But we don't want that to happen if we're driving along. So let's do a bit more work on the cue to make sure that the sound continues and changes as our velocity changes. So let's come out of the game, go back to our cue, and I'm going to introduce another node in here called crossfade by parameter. So drag that in and drag in our engine start, and then put it to the output. And we're going to add in another wave player here now. So you can either actually let's just copy that, Control W to copy that and attach it to the other crossfade input. But this time we're going to use the engine loop sound we created. So what we want this crossfade to do is do the engine start when we're at a very low velocity, and then use the loop sound when we go above a certain velocity so that it doesn't shut off. But what velocity is going to drive this? Well, first of all, let's create a parameter that drives this. Doesn't matter what we call it, but we'll reference it later. So let's call it velocity. So we're going to use the velocity of the vehicle to drive this crossfade. And then we're going to need to put in some parameters for what velocity input drives the fade in and fade out of these particular waveforms. So in order to determine the velocity that we need to put in here, let's put in a print string in the game for velocity and see what the range is that we're going to go from and to. So go back to your pickup truck, and in the begin play, actually the event tick here, we're actually getting the velocity. So you get velocity vector length because we were using that to drive the sound spray when we went over a velocity of 300. So let's just put a print string in here temporarily. So I've just put it after the event tick, and I'm going to put the vector length in here. So this will just print out the velocity every tick. And let's give that a go and just have a look at the range of values. So you see we're starting off at 0, and we're quickly up to 1,000. I'm going to try and keep accelerating without crashing. We're up to almost 3,000. Yeah, over 3,000. And I think it goes up to about 4,000 in total. So that's our range of velocity that we want to have as inputs in the game, in the queue. So go back to the queue, and we'll go to this crossfade by parameter. So let's start with the fade in and parameter value. So what we'll do here is we'll say, let me just pull that out so you can see what it's actually saying. It's saying when the sound will start and when the sound will end fading in. So 0 is standing still, And let's say that once we get to 10, velocity of 10, it's faded in completely, the first wave, which is the engine start. And then we want it to quickly fade out. So let's say from 100 to 200, it fades out. So pretty much instantaneously, it will move from the engine start to the engine loop. So the engine loop input, we want to start at 100 and finish fading at 200. So that would effectively take over from this engine start loop, and it'll become the engine loop wave. And it wants to fade out at, let's say, 3,500 and 4,000. And we'll keep the volume constant at 1. So all this will do is it will use the velocity. Well, it won't use it yet because we've got to put some extra programming in, but it will move from the engine start to the engine loop based on this velocity value. So let's save that, go back to the pickup, and what we can do now is, instead of this print string, let's remove that, we now want to drive this engine noise velocity parameter by the velocity output from the event tick. So drag in the engine noise with Control and drag off that, and if you do set parameter, it's a float parameter that we want to set. So click on set float parameter, attach it to the event tick and attach it to the branch. The in name is the name we gave it, which was velocity. So that was the name. If I go back to the queue, that was the name, the parameter name we gave here. And the value we want is from this vector length here. So what will happen is that as the velocity changes, it will set the velocity in this engine noise parameter, and that will cause, let's compile it, that will cause the velocity to switch the waveforms between the start waveform and the loop waveform. So let's play it. You won't notice much difference here. It'll be quite subtle. Right, so first of all, here there's no sound at all at the moment. Because we're at velocity 0, it hasn't faded in even the start sound yet. And as we start the engine, it plays the start waveform, but it almost immediately cross-faded into the engine loop waveform. So it will continuously loop as long as we're moving. It won't stop until we go to a standstill. So you can see as soon as we went back to 0, the engine started again. So that's a good start, but real engines change in volume and pitch as you accelerate. So let's do that next. So let's go back to our queue, and this time we're going to put in a thing called a continuous modulator to change the pitch and the volume based on the parameter. So what we'll do here is drag in a continuous modulator, attach it to the output of the crossfade by parameter and attach it to the output. And what you'll notice is this continuous modulator allows you to modulate pitch and volume. So the parameter, we'll use the same parameter, we'll use that velocity. So make sure you call the pitch modulation parameter velocity and the volume modulation parameter velocity. And now we want to map the velocity inputs to the pitch and volume outputs we want. So we want to go from 0 to 4,000 in velocity. And then let's do the pitch from 1, which is no pitch change, to 1.5. So that's a 50% rise in pitch once it gets to the maximum velocity. And in the volume section, we'll put the same range of inputs, 0 to 4,000. And then we'll start off at the volume of 1, so no volume change. And maybe we'll go up to 3 times volume once it gets to the maximum velocity, and save that. And so that should now, as well as switching between the start and the loop, it will now increase the pitch and the volume based on those velocity inputs. We're already updating these velocity inputs every tick, so that's already done. So if I save that and go into play mode, and let's start going forward, you can hear that there is a rise in pitch as the velocity increases. And there's also a change in volume as well, but that's quite subtle. And you can adjust these pitch changes and volume changes to suit your requirements. If we stop, engine restarts, and it's pretty effective. There's lots of videos on YouTube that go into a lot more depth onto what you can do with engine sound, so I'd recommend you go and seek them out if you want to do anything very sophisticated. But for me, this fits the bill for now. So let's move on to the third and final sound I want to show you today. So that is a sound for when you go through the gate and score. So let's get rid of this engine cue, go back to the game, and you'll notice at the moment when I go through the gate and score, there's no audio feedback to me or the other players to tell me that I actually scored. So I want to create a sound when the player goes through the gate, but I want that sound to be heard by everybody in the game so that other people know that another player has scored as well. So it's very similar to the play sound we did in the desert ambience, and we just got to decide where we're going to put that sound. So you could put it in the gate controller. Because we want this to play on all players, the player controller is probably the best place to put this. And where we want to put it is in the score handling. So when we add a score here, we want to play a sound there. So after we've added the score, which only gets triggered when you go through a gate, add another node. So we're going to do the play sound 2D again. And you can choose whatever sound you want. There's actually an inbuilt sound camera shutter here. If you can't see these sounds, just make sure in your view options you're showing engine content and other content as well. So I believe the engine content has this camera shutter icon, which is a bit of a beep, and that will play the sound every time we add the score. But it won't quite work as we want to at the moment. If you look where we're adding it in the server add score. So this play sound is playing on the server, and I'll show you what issue that causes. Remember, we wanted to play it for all players. So go to your play mode. Let's do it 2 players. Right, so I'm on the server. Let's go through the gate. And I hear that beep sound, so that's great. Now I'll switch over to the client, and let's find the next gate over here. And if I go through the gate, there's no sound, and that's because it played on the server only. So what we need to do, let's come out of play mode. What we need to do is, when we add the score on the server, we want to let all the attached players know to play this sound. So that's pretty straightforward. Let's create a little bit more space here and disconnect this with Alt, move it along. We'll do a multicast from the server so that it's sent to all of the controllers to play that sound. Let's create a new custom event. We'll call this MC for multicast. Play sound, and attach that to the play sound. And now all we need to do is call this, actually we need to make sure this multicast replicates as multicast. It's up to you whether you want to make it reliable or not. It's not essential, I suppose. And then from the server add score, we'll call this MC play sound event. So what that'll do is it'll add the score on the server, and then replicate that to all of the player controllers and play the sound on those. So it should now play on all of the attached clients as well as the server. So compile and save. Let's go into play mode. Right, check it out on the server first. That works as before. Switch over to the client. Find the next gate, it's just behind me. And when I go through, it plays the sound because of the multicast event. So I could test this out on multiple clients as well, but I have done it before and it works fine. So I hope you found it useful. We've added 3 sounds using 3 different techniques today. We're almost at the end of this series. In the next episode, I will create a front end for hosting and joining the game, and we'll actually build the game so you can play it over your home network. And we'll probably do a final episode on some tweaks. As I've been going through this, I've noticed a couple of things that I would have done differently. So we'll look at that as well. But we're almost at the end, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye for now, and see you soon.